Welcome everybody, my name is Brendan Snyder, thank you for joining me. With the untimely passing of former Bad Company and Ted Nugent vocalist Brian Howe at the age of 66, I wanted to take a look back at his career and his musical releases. He was born on July 22nd of 1953 and died 2 days ago on May 6th of 2020. For some background music, I wanted to put on one of his solo albums, Circus Bar, that came out in 2010. I think this is a really great, phenomenal album in the classic vein of the Bad Company era that we like and know him for. So we're going to put that on. We're going to enjoy some music by him, and we're going to look back at his career and celebrate it. So Brian Howe got his start, interestingly enough, in a new wave of British heavy metal band called White Spirit. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because the guitar player in that band was Janet Gears, who later goes on to join Iron Maiden and have huge success with them. So kind of interesting that this early group, White Spirit, had two members that ultimately went on to much bigger and better things, having left that group. And in 1984, he partnered up with Ted Nugent and joined his band and released the Predator album. And this album, in my opinion, is really good. I like it a lot. It kind of got a bad rep as Ted Nugent material being more pop rock in that vein, but I thought it was really stunning the way that it was done, and I like Brian Howe's vocals on it. But the deal that Brian Howe signed with Ted Nugent to be in the band wasn't very favorable to him financially, and ultimately at the end of that tour he decided to leave for a solo career. And so Brian reached out to Mick Jones of Foreigner, who he'd attempted to work with earlier in his career. Nothing got off the ground at that time, and at this time nothing happened either, but Jones did put him in contact with Mick Rouse and Simon Kirke, formerly of Bad Company at that time. Now, Mick and Simon were looking to form a new group, and in 1986 they decided to work together and do just that, but their record label, Atlantic Records, insisted that it had to be Bad Company. And so they did reach out to Paul Rodgers, their former vocalist, but he was off doing The Firm with Jimmy Page, and so he didn't want to leave that, and ultimately Mick Rouse and Simon Kirke needed a new vocalist, and they had remembered Brian Howe and having met him and discussing things with him and whatnot, so they decided to partner up with him. And in 1986 they recorded and released their first album together with him, Fame and Fortune. But this one here was very heavily layered with keyboards. It was not typical to the Bad Company sound. Unfortunately, fans did not connect with it, and it just didn't do very well. Paul Rodgers' vocal style, their former vocalist, is much more blues rock based, but Brian Howe's vocals are much more pop rock based, and while that was something that Atlantic Records was very happy with, this album sort of overdid it in my opinion, and that's why I don't think it connected with their fans. And I think they made a good decision following this, which was they dropped the keyboards. They actually went out on tour with Deep Purple to sort of build up their credibility again as a rock band, and they came back in 1988 with Dangerous Age, a much more guitar-driven, harder rock album like the Bad Company stuff that we know. And this one is my favorite of all of the Bad Company era that he was singing with them. It's also the first album that partnered them up with Terry Thomas, who would figure in much more prominently later going on within their career. But he was the one who returned them to that guitar-driven song, and it spawned two really big radio hits, the songs Shake It Up and No Smoke Without a Fire. And so following that album, in 1990 they released Holy Water, and this album was even more successful than the previous one. This album charted at number 35, and it spawned two really big radio hits, the namesake of the album, Holy Water, and also If You Needed Somebody. Eventually the album went on to sell 1 million copies. Now that album was predominantly written by Terry Thomas and Brian Howe, and so at that point the band started to argue between themselves and weren't getting along as well, and this being all over money, who's doing more of the work, who should get paid what, and so forth. But the the band and everyone, talked things out, and ultimately they decided to keep things together, and they worked on a new album at that point, and I'm really glad they did, because they released a really great album in Here Comes Trouble in 1993. And this album here also was really successful for them. It hit number 40 on the charts. It eventually went gold. And you have to remember that even while the last album had sold 1 million copies, this was 1993. It was after grunge had hit, 2 years into that. And so for a band like this out of the 80s, and even if you consider them the classic rock band, that they were from the 70s, to be able to sell 500,000 copies in 1993 was a really big deal. So the whole career really of Bad Company's with Brian Howe, despite maybe that first album, Fame and Fortune, was very successful. And before they ultimately decided to end things in their relationship, they did release one final album, a live album called What You Hear Is What You Get. And if you want to hear a good overview of the whole Brian Howe era of Bad Company, that's a really great album to check out there. Now, following the Bad Company stint, he decided he was finally going to go solo and recorded an album and released it in 1997 called Tangled in Blue. And while at the time when this came out, I really enjoyed it, I listened to it profusely. It was just great to finally have some new material from him, since there hadn't been anything since 1993. But it was a much more mellow, introspective affair. Again, not in the Bad Company style. Again, it didn't connect with the Bad Company fans that he had built up, and it kind of just disappeared without a trace at that time. And I think partly because of that, and I know he'd had a long career prior to that, but it was 13 long years until his next solo release, the one we're listening to right now, Circus Bar, finally came out in 2010, and this one's a stunning release. Definitely my fave of the two solo records. It definitely returned him to that Bad Company sound that we all know and love him for. But while it had been a really long time since he had put out an album, musical taste had drastically changed. This one in no way was going to break any records or do anything like that, but it is a really great record. If you're not familiar with it, do check it out. What I like about this record, not only just being that it's a great solid rock record, but he actually re-recorded 2 of his Bad Company songs. He did the songs How About That and Holy Water, 2 of the biggest songs off of the Bad Company album. So you get a new take on those, a modern version of it, along with a really great rock record. And those are sprinkled throughout. They're not just like bonus tracks at the end. So as you're listening to the album, they do come up and play on it. And then 7 years go by before he releases this compilation here, and it had one new recording called Hot Tin Roof. And there was a lot of kind of hype and excitement behind this because he was going out on the road, he was touring again, he had recorded that new song, and a lot of people were hoping that it would lead to him finally recording, a whole new album. This was an internet-only release. He was autographing them at the time. I'm really glad I was able to pick it up now. I don't know if they're still selling them on the website, but I would check it out, as I can imagine these won't stick around for very much longer. And so, with all that hype and excitement out there, everyone was hoping this was going to lead to something. But unfortunately, with his untimely passing on May 6th of 2020, just 2 days ago, obviously this isn't going to happen. He did die at home in Florida, where he's from cardiac arrest at the age of 66. Please do yourself a favor and go check some of these releases out. I think they're really fantastic. Ted Nugent's Predator from 1984. He did 4 albums with Bad Company. Also did that live album, this between 86 and 1993. He's got his 2 solo releases, Tangled in Blue from 1997. That's a much more mellow album, but the really rockin' Circus Bar from 2010, the one we're listening to now, and that compilation from 2017. Rest in peace, Brian Howe. You certainly will be missed, but your music obviously is going to live on. It'll certainly live on right here in my heart, and I hope along in the hearts of all your fans out there. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye, and I'll see you all real soon.